Okay. Darwin. Darwin is considered the first person to come up with this theory of evolution by natural selection. He's not the first one to come up with a mechanism for evolution, as we'll see. Oh. How do you like my shirt? What does it say?
It says the body of Kira created day, Genesis, something.
Day 6.
Created day 6, Genesis.
Yeah, exactly. About the same time, I guess, as Adam and Eve were created. Would God really do that? He's a merciful God. Put Adam and Eve together with a T-Rex. Doesn't seem like a very merciful God to me. But anyway, if you ever get a chance to go to Kentucky, Petersburg, Kentucky, which is right across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, Ohio, they have a creation museum. And it is great. It costs a bit of money. It's like 25 bucks a pop or something. And it shows Genesis and all that kind of stuff. And it's really wonderful, I have to tell you. They also added to it. Anyway, I got this shirt and a cap when I was there. I was tickled to death. Okay, now, it turns out creation, intelligent design, those are religious people. This is their creation myth. Now remember, lots of different cultures have different creation myths, but in this one, you can read about the creation myths in the Bible. There's actually 2 creation myths, but the creation myths say that, in fact, the Earth is only 6,000 years old. So, if we go and measure the Earth to test that, what's the prediction? The prediction is that we will find rocks that are no older than 6,000 years. Or, also, if it's God or some creator who created everything, they probably did it perfectly. They didn't, mess up. And so, some things should happen. Like, we'll talk about those. But first of all, the universe, we know, is 13.8 billion years old. And it started with a Big Bang. That's the current theory of cosmology. And remember, theory is not just, it's only a theory. But we also know the Earth because of what's called radiometric dating, using radioactive isotopes and how fast they decay in rocks. We can also date different layers of the Earth. And we know that the Earth is about 4.54 billion years old, plus or minus 0.05 billion years. So 4.49 to 4.59. Okay? And so that seems to suggest that we've just refuted the creation and creation hypothesis. Now, furthermore, that creator made everything perfectly, we should not find designs that are suboptimal. In other words, with mistakes in them. Well, first of all, also, if they're perfect, things should not go extinct. if they're perfect, they should be able to keep breeding and producing offspring and all that. We know that that's not true. We can't really test fish. Fossils were put there by God or the devil to test belief or lead men astray. But we can say, oh, why do humans choke? Well, in other words, why would God make it so that humans are likely to choke on, let's say, a nice big piece of ribeye that goes down the wrong way? Or giraffes, very long neck. Well, they have a cranial nerve for facial muscles and all that. And one of the cranial nerves goes all the way down to where the heart is in the body and then back up again. Why would God do that? Doesn't make any sense. There's also, why are there vestigial traits or traits that have lost their former function? We have lots of them. We have a tailbone, and that's a vestigial trait because our ancestors at one point had a tail. We'll talk about that later. That had a very big effect on my life, and you'll find out why. I just went through and kind of refuted all the predictions of creation or intelligent design. Now, I'm not saying that you have to make a choice between this or believing in God. We don't do that. You can believe in God all you want, but this is as true as the Earth is not the center of the universe, but is a planet around a solar system and a galaxy among billions of galaxies. Or plate tectonic theory. Okay? Okay, let's go on. Now, explanations for biological diversity. In other words, all these different types of organisms on this planet. Now, if we actually look at things, okay. If at one point everybody thought that each creature on this planet and each plant and all that was created separately by some creator, that they were independently created, so that each was created perfectly for what that individual creature had to do to make a living. And that those creatures were then left that way and they didn't change. There's also something called transformation, kind of where there was separate creation, but then over time, individuals actually did change in a character. Let's say God created an elephant with a shorter trunk, and over time it became longer. And then finally, the third explanation, among many, is evolution. And evolution, each of these places where it comes together are called nodes, and that's where two lineages had a common ancestor. They shared a common ancestor. In other words, this group right here, there was a common ancestor right here, and then it split first into this group, and then into this group, but just a single this group, and then that further split right here into two separate species. And if you go back in time, you can trace back where the common ancestor was. And then for this group, there was a common ancestor here, and then right here, of course, we have a common ancestor for the whole, all the different groups. Yes?
Can you give an example of a node?
Okay. So, there's a node, let me do it. I'll draw it. Good point. Okay. Okay. Now, so here is the ancestor for species A and species B. So, common. Okay, on tape anyway. Oh, you butt, dirty bastard. Oh. Okay, good. Okay, there. Okay, now. Oops, what am I doing? I don't care about that. Okay. Now, history of evolutionary thought. Now, obviously, there are other. This is Western philosophy, usually from Europe, the Mediterranean, the Arab regions, all that. Chinese has a different history in terms of how things, let's say, started, the origination of things, but here we are. Now, Plato, he had this idea of what's called an imperfect ethos. And the allegory of the cave. Anybody know what the allegory of the cave is? Yeah.
Isn't it his idea that where he put people in a cave without any light, and then the only thing they could see was a shadow of an image behind them. They couldn't turn back, so they had to face forward. But then when they got out of the cave after a couple of months or days,
Yeah. They realized.
Yeah.
Yeah, the year. Okay. So they actually did have light. They had a fire. Okay. So the allegory was the cave was that you had a person, and it's dark except for this fire, and then there are shadows on the wall. And this person thinks the shadows are actually the universe, or what's true. He doesn't realize, in fact, that when he goes outside, there is the real world. Well, Plato thought that our real world is to the perfect world what the shadows on the cave are to the real world. Okay? So there's a perfect world, the imperfect ethos is that we live in the real world, but it's not the real world. Okay? And then there was this idea that there were things that were created, types. So you had a giraffe, you had an elephant, you had a human. Okay? And then Aristotle, he had this great chain of being. Starts out with stone, and then flame, and then plant, and then beast, and human, and heaven, then angel, then God, and then, what did it say at the top? Professor Beck. Okay. Right. Now, so that's a great chain of being. I just want you to understand it. And then there was a Judeo-Christian creator that we just kind of went through, but that organisms that had things that made them perfectly adapted to their environment, it looks like they were created by the benevolence of the Creator. And then finally, there was this guy in the 18th century named Carolus Linnaeus, and he was the first one to actually make a classification of all things, including rocks and plants and all this. In fact, botany is a study of plants. Well, it's also a study of fungus, of mushrooms, because mushrooms are anchored in place just like plants are. It turns out, though, just so you know, that we are much more closely related to a mushroom than we are to a plant. And the mushroom, the fungus, is also much more closely related to us than it is to the plant, even though it looks somewhat similar. Okay. Now, some stuff started happening in Europe and probably elsewhere. People were finding fossils. For the most part, they didn't know what they were. They didn't even think about it, but some people in Europe did. And one of them was a guy named Georges Cuvier in Paris. He was a French kind of geologist. And he noticed that in the Paris Basin, there was all this fossilized seafloor that had been sedimentary, the things falling down to the bottom of the sea, and then that had eventually solidified into rock, and within that seafloor were all kinds of fossils. And the thing is, Paris, remember, is not by the sea. It's far away from the sea. And it's higher than the sea, so he was wondering how it got there, this ancient seafloor. And he thought there might have been a giant flood that deposited all this stuff. Now, he wasn't religious at all. This was shortly after the French Revolution. And of course, other people who were religious then used this idea of a big flood as, oh, that's when Noah, all that happened. Okay. Now, then there was a guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he was in late 18th, early 19th century, and he came up with an actual mechanism in terms of how organisms evolved. And first of all, I believed in spontaneous generation, and then through use and disuse, inheritance of what are called acquired characteristics. So, I'm 5'3". I wanted my offspring to be taller, according to him, how could I become taller? Anybody?
Mating with a taller man.
Huh?
Mating with somebody who's taller.
Well, like what would make me taller? Think about something that was used in the past as a form of torture. Yeah, the rack. So I would go and be put on a rack every day to stretch me out, and perhaps over time I might get to be 6'3". I'd have probably bad joints, but anyway, I'd be taller. And my offspring would also be taller. Okay? That was his idea. Or like with a giraffe and the length of the neck, as they're trying to reach higher and higher branches, their neck stretches out and they pass it on to their offspring. That was pretty much the best explanation at that period of time. And then there was a Charles Lyell who actually showed that, yes, the Earth is changing, but that it's actually changing slowly. And unlike catastrophism and Cuvier, there's something called uniformitarianism, where the same processes that were happening now were happening long ago. It turns out they were both right. For the most part, things change very slowly with the same processes: erosion, evolution, all that. But occasionally something big happens, like an asteroid hitting the Earth, and then everything has changed for the worse. And that Lyell believed in adaptation, and that in fact organisms, wherever they are, they do adapt to the place they're at. So if they're on a desert island, they adapt to a dry environment. Okay, good. Now, so he grew up into that kind of a society where he didn't have to work, but it was considered poor form not to go and work and do something productive. Now, there were some people during that time and other times who didn't do that. They just went out and played like playboys, like Lord Rochester in the 17th century. If you ever want to read about an incredible guy, great poet, but oh, he was crazy. But anyway, so Darwin, he thought he was going to eventually become a vicar. Anyone know what a vicar is? Okay, the Church of England, a vicar is kind of like a priest. But he studied natural history with George Lyell, I talked about. And so he was interested in a lot of things. So he went on this voyage as the ship's naturalist for about 5 years, all the way around the Earth. And he went and collected stuff for the Queen, for England. And that's when he saw things that were interesting. There was another guy by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace who was born about 20 years later, and he was not highborn, he was lowborn, but he too somehow managed to go, I think, to Oxford or something like that. And he was a collector. He made his money by collecting stuff all over the world and sending it back to his rich patrons. And so here, by the way, is Darwin, who went all the way around the world, and then finally back up. But Wallace first sailed to South America and got a big collection, and then sent it on a ship back to England. Unfortunately, the ship sank. So then he went to Southeast Asia. And this is, let's see, what did he do? Here we go. Okay, into Southeast Asia and Australia. And this is where he had his epiphany about evolution by natural selection after Darwin. He was considered the father of biogeography, which is the study of where organisms are and why they're there. And so past and present distribution. And he noticed that there was something here called the Wallace Line along this great trench. And over here was Southeast Asia, and then over here was animals and plants that are more like found in Australia, including marsupials. Anybody know what a marsupial is? Yeah.
Isn't it a type of mammal that usually have a pouch?
Exactly. So there are three types of mammals. There's egg-laying mammals. There's only a couple of species of those. And then there's marsupials that the embryo actually underdeveloped crawls out of the vagina and then up and goes into a pouch, attaches to a nipple, and then develops inside the pouch. Kangaroos do that, opossums. Okay. And Australia originally had no placental mammals like ourselves, where we actually gestate inside the body cavity and then the uterus and then live bear a young that way. So here is an example. All these over here are marsupials. All these are placental mammals. They're on one side or the other. Okay, so let's talk. What is evolution? Well, am I supposed to give you a warning? Well, okay, warning. Evolution is, why do I say, what is it about sex and death? Why do I say that? Any idea?
Reproduction, and then the death is what causes them to change, because whatever that adaptation.
It's actually survival instead of death. So, exactly. So, it's all about sex and death. You want to have as much sex as you can while trying to avoid the latter for as long as you can, unless you're into like mixing them up. But it's not usually advised, mixing up sex and death. You know, like asphyxiation or serial killers, for that matter. Okay. Now, it turns out, just so you know, that in terms of religion is pretty much concerned about the same exact thing. Most religious people are worried about dying, and the idea that there's life after death makes them feel better. So we're obsessed with dying, even though we all know we're gonna. And then, of course, if you look at most of the religions that we're familiar with, it's usually all about sex. Men controlling women so that they can produce offspring versus everybody else. Okay? Now, the difference is that I just study this, but a lot of people actually live this credo. Oh, and you can believe in evolution and God at the same time. It's not like it's either or, just so you know. Okay. What's evolution? What do you think?
The study of how we came to be.
Okay. Anybody else?
Sex and death.
Okay.
The process of any necessary change.
What?
The process of any necessary change.
I
Any,
can't.
like, you know, when things change every time.
Yeah.
Does it happen?
So the process that's making those changes happen.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, good. Okay. Anything else? You mentioned where we came from. What does that imply in terms of ancestry? That we actually came from some previous ancestor. Okay. So it looks like all life on Earth came from a common ancestor billions of years ago. And the reason it looks like that, by the way, if that was true, that we all share a common ancestor, then we should have shared certain things in common. One of those things in common is DNA. So all life on Earth uses DNA for the information for making different traits. And also part of that business in terms of transcribing those genes into proteins, they use a specific type of RNA. So single-stranded nucleic acid. So all life uses the same actual genetic code and the same way to translate that code into proteins. If this was, all those proteins are, there's something called chirality in chemistry, whether it's left-handed or right-handed in terms of its how it's put together. And it turns out all proteins in life are left-handed. Another thing. Okay, so okay, common ancestor. Now, what is the theory of evolution? There's actually 5 points. Evolution happens. Populations, in other words, change through time. Either the traits they have change through time, or the genes that they have change through time. And by the genes, I mean different variants of the same gene. Evolution usually happens gradually over millions of years, but sometimes it happens fairly quickly too. Organisms speciate from one ancestral species into two or more species. We see this in the fossil record and elsewhere. All species share a common ancestry as a result of splitting of lineages from one ancestral form to another. So here we are. Here is the common ancestor. All along here, that is the common ancestor for all these three species. Right at this node, where species A and then the ancestor of species B and C is, that's where the common ancestor or the population split, probably by geography, by one population getting separated from the other, so they couldn't breed anymore. And they went on their own evolutionary way. And then there was also another common ancestor for this group of species, and this too split. And that's the most recent common ancestor. And then if we actually look at this, those diagrams are called phylogenies. They actually show evolutionary relationships. They're also like a hypothesis. We hypothesize that this is how evolution proceeded in terms of speciation. So around 55 million years ago, there was some ancestral primate, and there was a split. And on the one side were this group of animals called lemurs and lorises and a few others that are primates, but they're proto-primates. They're very old kind of primates. And you can only find like lemurs in Madagascar. Okay? This other group included everything else, the anthropoids. So these are the proto-primates, and these are the anthropoid primates. And then there was another split, and there were New World monkeys and Old World monkeys. And then there was also gibbons, which is an ape. And all apes, what they have is they have no tail. They have a tailbone, but no tail, like us. And then the further up in time you go, all this splitting, we see here is a split between the common ancestor of gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. That split apart about 10 million years ago. And then the ancestors of humans and chimps look like it split about, 7 million years ago. Okay. Okay. Now, remember we're talking about predictions in terms of what the theory of evolution actually makes. What predictions does it make? So, if life on Earth originated in the very distant past and then evolved, should we see complex organisms right away or simple? Simple. And that's exactly what we see. The oldest fossilized organisms are cyanobacteria from about 3.5 billion years ago. And then as time went on, eventually there was the beginnings of multicellular life, and then that finally gave rise to animals and to plants and fungi and a number of different organisms or types of organisms. and things got more and more complex. And the traits that they had were associated with got more complex. So, like the first eye was not a fully developed eye with a lens for being able to focus distances and all that. It was probably just some cells that were photosensitive. So the organism could actually move toward light or away from light. And we still see those kinds of organisms with those kinds of eyes in a whole slew of different animals. Let's see, in that area, jellyfish are an example. It's not until later that we see the kind of eye that we have. And then it also, that kind of eye that we have actually evolved independently 2 different times, in vertebrates and then in cephalopods like squid and octopus and cuttlefish. Okay. Now, if evolutionary occurred within lineages and those lineages sometimes split, then we should be able to find examples of traits and species gradually changing over time. And we should be able to sometimes see one lineage dividing into 2 in the fossil record, let's say. And if all lineages share a common ancestor, those with a more recent common ancestor should have fewer genetic changes compared to those that are more distantly related. In other words, those that share a more recent common ancestor should have more of the same genes compared to those that are more distant related. So we still use many of the same genes that bacteria use, but we have a whole bunch of other ones that bacteria don't have. Okay. All organisms share common ancestry, then we should be able to find transitional forms that connect different taxa and modern groups with their common ancestors. Good example is birds. Turns out birds are actually dinosaurs. You've probably heard that. And if you actually look at the fossil record, before there were birds, there were actually feathered dinosaurs. In other words, feathers didn't evolve for flight. They evolved for something else. What do you think the feathers might have evolved for? Anybody?
Warmth?
Huh? Warmth. Okay, insulation. Are birds dull colored, or do they, a lot of them have color on them? Color. Why do you think that?
Attract the mate or to blend into surroundings or same areas.
Yeah. So, probably they're displaying for attracting a mate. Or telling a rival that I'm better than you because I've got a redder head than you, something like that. Okay. Whales, we found the same thing in the fossil record? Yeah.
So that's, so since you said being colorful is one of the traits of a bird, right?
Of feathers.
Feathers.
Feathers are used for that.
Okay, how does that like get passed down through evolution? Like,
Well, it looks like feathers originated from scales of skin. And individuals that have scaly skin perhaps were better at insulating themselves. And then eventually you ended up, over a very long time, feathers that were kind of like downy feathers that allowed dinosaurs to remain warm. In fact, it implies that dinosaurs were warm-blooded. It looks like that's the case. And then, so they got selection favored individuals with more feathers that provide more and more insulation, right? And that's what got passed down. And then, if there was any individual who had feathers that were slightly a different color, and they used some sort of display to attract a female, that was passed down the same way.
How does that like get passed down? Like
Okay.
do they get to choose
You-
what they pass?
No. So it's a mutation. Strictly genetic mutation. Individuals that are born with that mutation, they survive and reproduce. Individuals that don't have that, it's kind of like the cards you're dealt with, right? Someone's dealt with 4 of a kind, and someone's dealt with a pair of twos. Okay, who's going to win the pot? So it's not fair. It's just that so and so had a trait that allowed it to survive and reproduce better.
Natural selection.
Exactly, and this is great. This is a perfect example of the kind of questions you want. So how does natural selection work? It's not like individual organisms decide they want a certain trait and then pass it along. They're either born with the trait or they're not. If that helps them survive and or reproduce and pass their genes on to future generations, then so be it. The ones that don't have those beneficial traits, like 4 of a kind, they don't pass on any offspring. Their genes are a dead end. Like me, I'm one of the walking dead. Yep. I get to be kind of like Uncle Mo, so all the good things about kids, but none of the bad things. You take them for ice cream. You take them to go surfing. You take them for a night on the town. Okay, now, there's also something called when embryos develop from a single egg that's fertilized all the way into a creature that's then, let's say, born, they go through different stages. And according to evolution, we should see some of those stages as they're developing. So if you actually look, and we'll see this, we'll go into greater detail, but let's say you see an embryo for a human and an embryo for a shark. They're both vertebrates. They both start out looking almost identical in terms of being embryos. They both have tails. They also have gill slits. In other words, human embryos end up with gill slits. Over time, the tail goes away and the gill slits go away. Or what's happened is there have been genes that have been turned off. And so you don't get those sorts of things. So, like with whales, once in a while you'll actually find a whale with legs. And it's because there was a mutation that turned those genes on. Its ancestors had legs. And those genes were turned on and the whale has legs. Probably wouldn't survive very long, but they found instances of that. And then there's something called vestigial traits. Anybody know what a vestigial trait is?
Are those dead traits?
Huh?
Dead traits?
Dead traits. Yeah. Like an example?
Example would be you're talking about the whales, and they have those legs.
Right.
But sometimes, what's it called? There's the retractions, like the cases where very rare, but a whale will end up having those
Right.
legs and then the 2 at the bottom.
But they still have the bones there anyway, right? So, for tail bones like that, before we used to have a tail, the only thing that's left is a tailbone. That's vestigial. And there's also probably vestigial genes. That means the genes that were responsible for those traits have been turned off, or they have some mutation, they don't work anymore. And it turns out our genome is strewn with tons of dead genes. I also talked about biogeography and Wallace, and there should be a lack of endemic. Endemic means organisms that are only found in one location and not cosmopolitan. And the only endemic on oceanic islands, we should only, now remember these are islands that all of a sudden became islands because of volcanic eruptions or something like that. Not continental islands because of different levels in water levels, sea level. And that oceanic islands, if they have any life on them, they should be because of organisms that can actually disperse fairly easily. Whether they swim there, they fly there, they float there. And those are the kinds of taxa we should find, and we shouldn't find things like mammals or amphibians that can't swim out to an oceanic island like the Hawaiian Islands, and we don't. Most similar species on oceanic islands are all usually from an ancestor that somehow made it from the nearest continent. Endemism has many scales, from islands to continents to, like actually states aren't real geologic structures, geographic structures, but some states have, let's say, birds that are only found there. Okay. Oh, now, if there was a designer, and he was a good designer, like a decent engineer, you design something so that it works really well. You would not expect an engineer to make something with a bad design. But it turns out we and all other organisms are strewn with things that are badly designed, like a prostate gland that surrounds the urethra. So when men get older, their prostate enlarges, presses on the urethra, and they can't pee very well. Pandas. The thumb, they actually have 6 fingers, but the thumb is actually not a thumb. It's from the sesamoid bone, but it's used for gripping, just like a regular thumb on our hand is. But it's related to a bear, and bears don't have paws that are built for that. They're built for running fast and things like that, and tearing things apart. Humans are prone to choking. Our far-off ancestors were fish that developed a swim bladder for buoyancy, but that eventually became kind of like a proto-lung that wasn't very good, but got some oxygen from the atmosphere instead of the water. If evolution results largely from natural selection, then we should be able to find selection operating on organisms in nature, and we do. So what we do is we actually find evidence of evolution all over the place because of ancestry in terms of fossil record, vestigial organs, quirks of development, like gill slits, bad design, genetics, where species are distributed and why they might be there, not elsewhere. And we've also found evidence of evolution in real time. Now, remember, evolution is a theory. It's a scientific theory. That means we should be able to prove that it's wrong if it's actually wrong. I did that with creationism, but let's say I look back in time and there were footprints from a T-Rex and a human being in the same rock strata. The human being tracks, they went for certain ways and then they disappeared because the T-Rex grabbed it and that was the end of it, right? Okay. But we don't find that. Also, we don't find mammals in the Devonian period, which was 400 million years ago, well before any of the first proto-mammals did ever evolve. You can only have evolution if you have variation. All populations have variation. Adaptations, that's only good for a second species, not the species you're looking at. That doesn't make any sense. Adaptation that would not have evolved by a step-by-step process, like an eye. We shouldn't finally find in the fossil record a fully developed variable focus eye. And we don't. The first kinds of eyes we find are in fact animals that just have tissue that's photosensitive. Adaptations that are bad for the individual, but good for the population species. In other words, you hear for the good of the species. No. Adaptations enhance an individual's fitness at the expense of others who don't have those traits. Okay? If it's for the good of the species, or, well, most of the individuals in the species have descended with those traits that help them to survive and reproduce. But it's a byproduct. Altruistic behavior. In other words, you shouldn't help non-relatives, only relatives. Of course, we can say that perhaps we can find altruistic behavior. Won't find it in humans where we help strangers. Maybe you should stop doing that. Discordance between those diagrams I showed you of traits versus the genes that underlie them. Greater genetic distance. Actually, that's wrong. In other words, more genetic changes between distant related versus closely related taxa. So, evolution by natural selection. We have Darwin and Wallace. Darwin came up with it first, but he didn't publish. And then Alfred Russel Wallace wrote him, and then they ended up publishing together. Individuals vary, providing the source for populations to actually change over time. Populations evolve, individuals don't. Species change over time. The process of natural selection is the primary force for that kind of change. There's other forces that are involved too, but we'll do that later. So there was two great ideas were evolution by natural selection, which is a process, and descent from a common ancestor. You can read this on your own. It's the last paragraph in The Origin of Species. Some essential concepts. Let's see. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that interbreed. Individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve. Alleles, a variant of a gene. So, there are two alleles in this population, A1 and A2. We're diploid, so we all have two copies, one from mom, one from dad. And if we have two A1s, you're going to be blue, chicken. Two A2s are going to be orange. And A1, A2, one of each, you're going to be green. And in the middle, those are gametes with only a single type of allele, one or the other. And then you have these genotypes, which are what those individuals look like and how they act. And then the outward expression of that is called the phenotype. And that means how an individual looks and acts and develops and all that based on the kind of phenotype that they have. And a gene pool are all the different alleles in the population. So every individual has two, in this population has two alleles, either the same two alleles or different. You can have many more alleles out there. You can have thousands of alleles for the same gene. But each individual is only going to have two, unless it's a sperm or an egg. So that's the gene pool from which evolution draws which genotypes actually have better fitness. So example, if these chickens lived in an environment where it was really green, who might survive better? A1, A2, an individual that had one blue and one orange. Those individuals will leave more offspring than anybody else. Let's see. Okay. The essence of evolution, it's a process of evolution, is that heritable traits, heritable variants or genes that are from mutations are passed down into a population, and so there's a mutation. If it's a good mutation, it stays in the population. If it's a bad population, it's weeded out. And then those alleles that lose their benefits over time, let's say, they go extinct. So the frequencies of, let's say, different alleles, like 50% blue and 50% orange, over time they fluctuate depending on how selection acts. Okay, and then this is where we'll pick up the different forces of evolution.